Hey, David.
Hey, Sarah.
First of all, congratulations on
You.
your award-winning story.
Thank you
Can,
very much.
can you tell me a little bit about the story?
My story is called Chelm, New Jersey. Um, it's kind of a reimagining of the town of Chelm, which is the well-known town of pious fools. That's originally kind of a shtetl in Poland or Russia. And there are a lot of folk tales that have been told about Chelm over the years. And I was inspired to kind of play with that idea, and I created this town called Chelm, New Jersey, which instead of being, in a shtetl in the 19th century, these stories take place in the here and now, just over the Hudson River from New York City in a suburb of New York called Chelm. It's a mystical town, and this is what I'm hoping is the first in many stories, because once I kind of came up with this idea that Chelm exists here and is in the United States and is like a reflection of what the Jewish community looks like right now, there are all sorts of possibilities. So I'm very excited to have people get to know what Chelm, New Jersey looks like.
And while you were writing or researching the story, did you read books, some of the Helm stories, or were there other authors that you turned to as inspiration?
There's I don't know if you can see it here. No, there it is. Right behind my head. There's this book right over here, A Treasury of Jewish Folklore, which was a book that I had when I was younger that I would read over and over again. It's edited by Nathan Ozabel. And there are a whole slew of Chelm stories in there that I came back to when I was where I was researching the story. I read those. There's a book written by Isaac Bashevis Singer. It's more of like a kid's book, but I read that. And then I was also doing research just into the concept of Chelm, of where it came from, and like where these folk tales started from, and just the general idea that Chelm is not, the only town of fools. As much as we might hate to admit it, Jews do not have a monopoly on the idea that there's a town of silly people who do very silly things. So there's a long history of folk tales around towns of fools, and that kind of just got me inspired to think of different ways that this could play out. But it was an interesting. One of the things that I was trying to figure out while I was writing this is, do I take the stories that I grew up hearing and that have inspired me, or do I invent new ones? And I ended up kind of, you know, finding a place in the middle. And I think I'm trying to invent new stories that really reflect like how we practice Judaism and what foolish things we might be doing, as opposed to trying to recreate older Chelm stories. Because I did that with one and it just felt a little forced, didn't quite work. I think folktales come out of what we're experiencing as opposed to trying to recreate the past.
What are some American Jewish isms you think that are sort of fit into Helm?
I would say read the story for people who want to know, because it's hard to know where to start. I think the voice of the story is I don't think of it as my own self. There's kind of a character. There's this person who goes into Chelm and reports back to Chelm to us to tell us what it's like there. And I feel like I'm very inspired by Jewish comedy in general. Like I grew up listening to Mel Brooks and like that Borscht Belt humor, and I think kind of that voice and that approach and that kind of wry look at Judaism and kind of making fun of ourselves is really, infused into the story. I always go back to a line that Mel Brooks says in the 2000-Year-Old Man like recordings from the 1960s, and it's just like, who knows, Jews are crazy. And I feel like it's kind of that voice is infused in it. What's one thing I think one thing that I look at in this first story is the way that money plays a big part in status in a Jewish community, and kind of like the balancing between, the respect for Jewish tradition and rituals, and the importance of like the things that have been a part of Jewish tradition throughout the generations, and then where money comes involved in that, and kind of like the American culture of money and that kind of influence and power being important, which I think is something that plays out in all sorts of Jewish communities these days.
Are there any Jewish American fiction writers, current ones that you're reading these days that inspire you?
I would say one, one writer that I think of that had an impact on this story was Nathan Englander, who I think wrote kind of a very bleak updated Chelm story a couple of years ago. It was a little while ago. That's not very recent, but I think that's somebody who does. But just like his approach to kind of taking, I mean, I think his book Kaddish.com as well is something that like takes these really, really Jewish topics and then just turns them into a narrative that is for everyone, isn't trying to like hide how Jewish it is and hold back. I think also Jonathan Safran Foer as well is somebody who there was that book Here I Am that is a large book that I got through recently, and I think there's just a very, very kind of intimate approach to how it engages with Judaism in a way where it's like, if you know, you know, and if you don't, you don't, and that's okay. And I think that's kind of how I'm approaching this. Like, I've asked people who, you know, as I was writing it, I was asking people like, do you have any idea what Chelm is? And people would look at me, even people who were Jewish and grew up Jewish in like, you know, a conservative tradition or reform or even Orthodox are like, what is that? What are you talking about? So it's kind of just like this, if you know what this is about, you know what it's about. And if not, I hope this entertains you anyway, and you can feel like you're a part of this tradition of a story.
I did think of the Englander story as I was reading your story. It definitely that story is really powerful, and I remember that.
Yes.
And on a side note, I think I read that maybe Seth Rogen is doing a series about Chelm.
I think Sacha Baron Cohen, maybe.
Oh, okay.
I hope Seth Rogen's involved too. He did that pickle movie.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know. Even that, I feel like to a certain extent was an inspiration to me. You asked me about like contemporary writers, but I think like even having seen that during the pandemic before I wrote this story was like the idea that you can take a tradition and kind of like repackage it. And that's based on a Simon Rich story too. So I think like that's, I would say, a Jewish writer who has had an influence on this. But like how you can take this culture and turn it into modern comedy, kind of like melding that approach with literature has been interesting to watch.
Are you a full-time writer, or are you working on something else?
My day job is in advertising.
Okay.
So I do write there too, but this is my first published piece actually. So the other things that I'm doing are I have other projects that I've been working on that are all unpublished. I also kind of am writing these musings about American culture and social media and things on Instagram, because that's what people do these days. And that's at OMG WTF David.
And I think a collection of stories about Chelm in America, I think, sounds fabulous.
Yes, I hope to move forward on that soon.
Well, thank you very much.